The morning 100 polished shoes trampled my front yard was the morning I stopped being the quiet neighbor and started being the lesson nobody in Cedar Hollow expected. So if you think this is just a petty story about grass and grudges, buckle up and hit subscribe, because what happened after I planted that hedge exposed secrets buried for 30 years, flipped the power structure of our little town, and turned a simple line of shrubs into the most talked about boundary in 3 counties. I bought the corner house because of the lawn. That might sound ridiculous, but when you grow up sharing walls and parking spaces, owning a wide stretch of green feels like breathing for the first time. My house sat beside the largest church in town, a white clapboard building with a narrow steeple and a bell that rang so faithfully you could set your watch by it, and at first I considered that charming. On my first Sunday there, I stood on the porch with coffee and watched families arrive in pressed suits and pastel dresses, children tugging at collars, older couples moving carefully arm in arm, and I remember thinking how peaceful it all looked. What I didn't notice that first week was the diagonal line faintly carved into the grass from the curb to the church steps, a pale scar that ran straight across my yard like an old habit nobody questioned anymore. It wasn't until the 3rd Sunday, when I heard laughter outside and saw a cluster of men in navy suits stride confidently over my property instead of along the sidewalk, that I realized the scar wasn't old at all. It was being refreshed weekly. I told myself it was harmless. It's just grass, I thought, and I didn't want to be the new guy who complains about tradition. But grass has memory, and so do people. The more they crossed, the deeper the line grew, until it wasn't just flattened blades but exposed soil, especially after rain, when heels sank and left craters that took weeks to smooth. I tried subtle hints at first, mowing in a pattern that emphasized the boundary, placing small decorative stones near the corner, even setting a lightweight trellis as if I were planning a garden bed, yet every Sunday the river of churchgoers flowed right around or over whatever I placed, smiling politely as if I were landscaping for their convenience. The first time I actually spoke up was after a wedding rehearsal when nearly 100 guests cut across in under 10 minutes, chattering, checking phones, one man even pausing to retie his shoe mid-yard, grinding the toe into my sod like he was stubbing out a cigarette. I walked over calmly and said, "Hey folks, would you mind using the sidewalk?" And the reaction wasn't anger but confusion, as if I had asked them to stop using air. A woman in pearls blinked at me and said, "Oh honey, we've always walked this way." Always. The word lodged under my skin like a splinter. Always meant before me, without me, despite me. I approached the pastor that week, expecting reason, and he listened with a sympathetic tilt of his head, promised to remind everyone gently, and for a couple of Sundays the traffic lightened, but habits reasserted themselves like weeds. It became almost comical how instinctively they angled across my yard, as though the sidewalk were an inconvenience designed by outsiders who didn't understand local customs. What changed everything was the annual revival service, an event that packed the church beyond capacity. Cars lined both sides of the street, engines ticking as they cooled, doors slamming in cheerful rhythm, and from my porch I watched a literal wave of people pour toward the entrance. I counted at first out of disbelief, 20, 40, 60, until I lost track somewhere past 90 as they fanned out across my lawn, skirts swaying, leather soles pressing, children racing each other along the worn diagonal like it was a racetrack. One teenage boy skidded on a damp patch and laughed, leaving a long gouge behind him. That was the moment the quiet resentment crystallized into clarity. They didn't mean harm, they simply didn't see me. My property had become negative space in their story, a convenient blank between curb and church. I went inside, opened my laptop, and began researching hedges with the intensity of a man studying battle plans. If they needed a visual cue stronger than polite words, I would give them one that photosynthesized. Within 2 weeks, a truck delivered mature boxwoods thick enough to block both vision and passage, and I hired a crew to plant them 5 feet inside my property line, running the full length of the corners so the diagonal path ended in dense green resistance. I stood back as the last shrub was tamped into place, dirt dark and fresh, and felt an odd mix of defiance and relief. The hedge wasn't aggressive, it was elegant, neatly trimmed, the kind you'd see bordering a historic estate, but its message was unmistakable: this is not your shortcut. Sunday came, and with it the test. I watched through the front window as the first cluster approached and slowed, like birds encountering glass. There was a ripple of hesitation, heads tilting, people scanning for the familiar gap that no longer existed. Some attempted to edge along the hedge's base, but I had extended it to meet a small wrought iron gate by my walkway, leaving no breach. Eventually they rerouted to the sidewalk, adding perhaps half a minute to their journey, but the psychological shift was seismic. By afternoon my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. It was the WA president, informing me that several complaints had been lodged about my obstructive landscaping. I asked her which regulation I had violated, and she cited none specifically, only a vague clause about maintaining community harmony. Harmony, apparently, meant accessibility to my grass. I attended the next WA meeting armed with property maps and a calm demeanor, only to find the room packed with church members, their expressions ranging from annoyed to bewildered. One man in a crisp blue suit argued that my hedge disrupted decades of tradition, that the diagonal had been used longer than I had lived there, as though tenure equaled entitlement. I replied that tradition without consent is just repetition, and repetition doesn't override ownership. The debate grew heated until an elderly woman raised her hand and said softly that she hadn't realized the lawn belonged solely to me. She had assumed it was shared space connected to the church, a relic of some old agreement. Her comment sparked murmurs, and that's when the first twist surfaced. After the meeting, a retired surveyor approached me in the parking lot and asked if I'd ever reviewed the original plat maps for the block. Curious, I hired him to dig into county records, and what he found stunned us both. Decades earlier, when the church expanded its lot, the boundary lines had been redrawn informally, but the paperwork was never properly updated. According to official records, not only was my lawn entirely private with no easement, but a narrow strip of what the church considered its parking area actually belonged to my parcel. 3 feet wide in the length of their eastern curb, small on paper, significant in implication. I wrestled with the discovery for days, recognizing the leverage it gave me. I could demand rent, force repaving, ignite a legal nightmare that would cost them dearly. Instead, I requested a meeting with the pastor and the WA president and laid the survey on the table. The room fell silent as they traced the lines with their fingers, realizing that the narrative of always was built on assumption, not law. I told them I had no intention of reclaiming the strip or escalating matters, but that respect had to be mutual. The hedge would stay, the shortcut would end. In exchange, I would sign a written acknowledgement allowing them to maintain their parking as is, provided the congregation adhered to the sidewalk route. The pastor agreed almost immediately, relief evident in his eyes, but the blue suit man objected, accusing me of coercion. That accusation might have stuck if not for the second twist, which arrived courtesy of a storm. 2 weeks later, torrential rain overwhelmed the church's aging drainage system, and water from their lot cascaded toward my yard, pooling dangerously near my foundation. Because I now understood the boundary intricacies, I contacted the city engineer instead of the WA, and an inspection revealed that the church's downspout redirection, installed years ago, funneled runoff precisely along the old diagonal path, exacerbating erosion on my property. The revelation shifted public opinion overnight. What had seemed like a petty dispute about walking paths became a legitimate infrastructure concern. Faced with municipal pressure, the church board convened an emergency session, and this time the blue suit man was conspicuously quiet. In a town hall meeting, the engineer explained that correcting the drainage would require collaboration with me to install a proper channel and rain garden along the boundary. Suddenly my hedge was no longer the villain, it was a protective measure highlighting a deeper oversight. Volunteers from the congregation showed up the following Saturday not to march across my lawn but to help dig trenches for the new system. As we worked side by side, stories surfaced about how the shortcut began decades ago when a previous owner informally told parishioners they could cross, a casual permission that fossilized into presumed right. No paperwork, no record, just a handshake lost to time. By sunset, the rain garden was framed with stones, the drainage corrected, and something else repaired as well, the understanding that courtesy must be renewed, not inherited. The WA formally withdrew its complaint and amended its guidelines to clarify that private property adjacent to community landmarks must be respected explicitly, not implicitly. The blue suit man approached me afterward, offering a stiff but sincere apology, admitting he had conflated convenience with entitlement. I accepted, because grudges are heavier than hedges. Months passed, and the diagonal scar in my lawn faded completely, replaced by uniform green that grew thicker each season. The congregation now streams neatly along the sidewalk, guided by subtle solar lights the church installed to improve visibility, and every so often someone waves at me from the curb, not as they cut across my yard but as they honor the boundary I finally had the courage to assert. The final twist came quietly on the anniversary of the hedge's planting, when the pastor asked if I would consider hosting the church's small group Bible study on my porch one evening as a gesture of renewed fellowship. I laughed at the irony, after all that, inviting them onto my property by choice, but I agreed. That night, A dozen folding chairs sat respectfully on my walkway, not a single foot straying onto the grass without invitation, and as we talked under string lights about forgiveness and stewardship, I realized the hedge had never been about exclusion. It was about visibility. Once the boundary was visible, so was I. So the next time someone tells you it's just grass, just a shortcut, just the way things have always been, remember this story and ask yourself who benefits from always. Sometimes the smallest line you draw teaches the biggest lesson, and sometimes planting a hedge doesn't divide a community, it finally defines it.